The decree had already been signed by the time Anastasia Prescott walked into the chamber. She felt it, the moment she crossed the threshold, the way the air changed, thickened, the way every pale and ancient face in the room turned toward her, with expressions that ranged from cold contempt to barely disguised triumph. The grand chamber of the Nocturne Court sat beneath the city of Vienna, carved from black limestone, 400 years before Columbus had ever set foot in the Americas, and tonight it smelled of betrayal. Evander Varcolac stood at the center of it all, and he was magnificent in his fury. He was tall, broader than the slender vampire nobles flanking him, with white hair that fell past his shoulders like a cascade of winter silk, and skin so pale it seemed almost luminous against the dark of his formal coat. His eyes, the color of thunderclouds lit from within by lightning, found Anastasia the instant she entered, and something in his jaw tightened in a way she had learned to read perfectly over 18 months of loving him. He was afraid, not for himself. For her, the Arch-Chancellor, Lord Caius Velthorn, sat at the head of the obsidian table that dominated the chamber's center. He was older than Evander by 3 centuries, and he wore that age the way generals wore medals, with pride and the casual threat of violence. Beside him, Lady Seraphina Draven had already arranged her expression into something politely sorrowful, the practiced grief of someone who has planned the funeral. On the table between them sat a scroll bearing the crimson seal of the Nocturne Court, and beside it, a smaller document that Anastasia recognized with a lurch of her stomach. It was a dissolution notice. Her name was on it. Anastasia Prescott, human consort, bonded by ancient rite on the 14th of October, bound to Evander Varcolac, lord of the Carpathian line, by blood law and sworn vow, and someone had drawn a single black line through both of their names. "You cannot be here," Velthorn said, his voice carrying the particular resonance that old vampires cultivated, low, inescapable, designed to press against the human nervous system like fingers on a piano key. "This is a court matter. The bond dissolution does not require your presence." Anastasia walked forward. She was wearing her work uniform because she had come straight from the restaurant, the small bistro on Mariahilfer Strasse, where she had waitressed for 3 years before Evander had walked into her life on a rainy Tuesday night and ordered black coffee. He did not drink and sat reading until 2 in the morning. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and a serving apron she had not bothered to remove. She was quite aware. Absolutely nothing like the kind of person who belonged in a chamber full of vampire nobility. She walked forward anyway. "I received a summons," she said clearly, pulling the folded card from her apron pocket and setting it on the table beside the dissolution decree. "Your seal, Lord Velthorn, your signature." Velthorn's eyes did not flicker. "A courtesy notice. Standard protocol when a bond is dissolved." "A courtesy," Evander said, his voice soft in a way that made 3 of the lesser nobles near the wall take a small, instinctive step backward. "That was issued without my knowledge or consent. The blood law does not require your consent in cases of cultural interference." Velthorn gestured to a second scroll beside the first, this one covered in tightly written text. Article 47 of the Nocturne Compact, ratified in 1622. When a bonded human demonstrates active interference in court proceedings, the bond may be dissolved by majority decree, regardless of the anchor's wishes. Anastasia looked at Evander. He looked back at her. In 18 months, she had learned every expression he possessed, the controlled blankness that meant he was furious, the fractional softening around his eyes that meant he was moved, the almost invisible tension in his hands that meant he was holding himself back from something he very much wanted to do. Right now, all three were present simultaneously, and she felt the familiar warmth of knowing him so completely, even here, even in the middle of this disaster. "What interference?" she said. Turning back to Velthorn, "Are you specifically alleging?" Lady Seraphina spoke then, lifting a sheaf of papers with the delicate precision of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment. "You attended the private session of the lower council 3 weeks ago. You sat in the gallery reserved for bonded consorts of full vampire members, and you listened to deliberations regarding the renewal of the Eastern Territories Compact." "I was invited," Anastasia said, "by Evander, who is a full vampire member of the lower council, which means I was exactly where the blood law entitled me to be. You then communicated the substance of those deliberations to a human journalist." Seraphina's voice was gentle, performatively regretful, the voice of someone delivering a verdict they have long since decided. The article published in the Vienna Independent 4 days later contained specifics that could only have come from that session. The chamber was absolutely silent. Anastasia looked at the scroll with the black line through her name. She looked at the dissolution notice. She looked at Evander, whose hands at his sides had closed very slowly into fists. Then she reached into her apron pocket again, and she pulled out a folded piece of paper that she had been carrying. Since the morning she had found it tucked beneath the door of Evander's estate. The morning that had told her with absolute clarity that someone in this court had been planning this for a very long time. "Before anyone in this room proceeds further," she said, her voice steady, "I want to read something aloud," and she unfolded the paper and she began. The story of how Anastasia Prescott came to stand in an ancient vampire court reading from a handwritten document while 12 immortal nobles stared at her in a mixture of fury and reluctant fascination began, as most of the best stories do, on a perfectly ordinary night that became extraordinary without any warning at all. She had been working the late shift at Bistro Lichtenberg, the small candlelit restaurant tucked into a narrow Viennese side street that catered primarily to insomniacs, academics, and the quietly wealthy. She had been working there for 3 years, having arrived in Vienna on a postgraduate fellowship that had ended, leaving her with a rental apartment she loved, a circle of friends she was not ready to abandon, and a lingering conviction that whatever she was supposed to do with her history degree would eventually become clear if she gave it enough time. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday in September when the front door opened and admitted a gust of rain-damp air and a man who stopped her mid-stride across the dining room. He was, quite simply, the most striking person she had ever seen in her life. Not beautiful in any conventional or expected way, though he was certainly that, but striking in the deeper sense, the way a landscape is striking, the way a storm is striking, the way something vast and old imposes itself on your awareness, and you know, without being told, that it was present long before you arrived and will remain long after you leave. He was wearing a dark overcoat that was expensive in the way that did not need to announce itself, and his white hair was slightly damp from the rain, and his eyes, when they found hers, were an exact shade she had never seen on anyone before, grey silver blue, like a sky that cannot decide between weather and calm. "Coffee," he said when she reached his table. "Black, please." He had very good manners, which she noticed because she had spent 3 years developing a finely calibrated sensitivity to the manners of people in restaurants, which was where character revealed itself most clearly. He said, "Please." He did not look at his phone. He read a book, a worn, cloth-covered thing without a visible title, and he turned pages slowly, the way someone reads who is actually reading and not performing reading. He did not drink the coffee. She noticed this too. It sat at his elbow, full, growing cold, untouched. He came back the following Tuesday and the one after that, always at the same time, always at the same table, always the same order, always the same untouched coffee. He always read. He always said, "Please" and "thank you" and "good night" when he left. He always left a tip that was precisely 30% of the bill, which she had calculated because she was curious about patterns. On the fourth Tuesday, she set down his coffee and said, without planning to, "You never drink it." He looked up from his book. Something moved in those grey eyes. Some that might have been amusement, or might have been something older than amusement. "No, then why order it?" A long pause. "It gives me a reason to sit here." She had thought about that sentence for a week. Not because it was particularly romantic, though in retrospect it was, but because of the precise, careful way he had said it, as though he had weighed every word individually and selected only the ones that were exactly true. On the fifth Tuesday, he told her his name. On the sixth Tuesday, she told him about the fellowship and the apartment and the history degree and the persistent conviction that something important was waiting for her, even though she could not yet see what it was. On the seventh Tuesday, he told her, with the same careful precision he brought to everything, that he was not entirely what he appeared to be, and she said she knew, and he went very still. "What do you know?" he asked. "I know you come in at midnight and always leave before 2, she said. "I know you never eat. I know you're always cold when you sit down even when the weather isn't. I know your coffee doesn't steam the way it should when you're near it, as if the heat is leaving it faster than physics normally allows. And I know that 3 weeks ago when that drunk man at table 6 grabbed my wrist, you were across the room in about 1/3 of a second, and no human being moves like that." Another very long pause. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm a historian," she said. "Every mythology in the world has a version of what I think you are. I've been reading about it for 6 weeks. What I found fascinating is how consistent the core attributes are across completely isolated cultures." His name was Evander Varcolac. He was 431 years old. He was, by the internal hierarchy of the Nocturne Court, a lord of the Carpathian line, which meant his bloodline was among the oldest and most powerful in the vampire world, and which meant, as he explained with a dry patience that she found immediately endearing, that he had political obligations and social entanglements that he had been managing since before the 30 Years' War, and which showed absolutely no sign of simplifying themselves. She asked intelligent questions. He answered them honestly. This, he told her later, was when he began to understand that she was going to be important to him, not because she was fearless, though she was, and not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she listened to his answers with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to understand, not just to hear. They talked until the restaurant closed. He walked her to the door of her apartment building in the rain, and she said, "Good night." And he said, "Good night." And then he said, "May I come back?" "Not to the restaurant." "Yes," she said. He came back the following night. He came back every night after that. She learned the scope of what she had stepped into gradually, not because Evander concealed it from her, but because it was genuinely vast and complex and required context before it could be properly understood. The Nocturne Court was not a legend. It was a functioning governing body, ancient and intricate, operating beneath the surface of modern European cities in the same limestone and marble spaces it had occupied for centuries, updated only where absolutely necessary, resistant to change in the particular way that institutions become when the people who built them are still alive to defend them. The court governed all vampire activity across 37 countries. It maintained the compact with human authorities, a shadow treaty that had been renegotiated in various forms since the 17th century, in which the court pledged to prevent vampire predation on the human population, and human governments pledged, through a small network of specifically briefed officials, to look the other way on certain activities and to classify certain evidence. It was, Anastasia concluded after 3 months of learning about it, essentially a very old and very powerful organized crime family that had convinced itself it was a government, which was, she noted, a description that applied to most actual governments as well. Evander was one of the court's most powerful members and one of its most politically complicated. He was old enough and strong enough that most of the other lords deferred to him on matters of genuine importance, and politically independent enough that factions who needed a majority found themselves perpetually calculating whether they could bring him in or would need to go around him. Lord Caius Velthorn, the Arch-Chancellor, had been going around him for 80 years, and the frustration of this had curdled over decades into something that looked remarkably like hatred. The ancient rite of bonding was exactly what it sounded like. It was the oldest legal instrument in the Nocturne Court's history, predating the Compact, predating the current charter, predating almost everything except the bloodlines themselves. When a vampire of sufficient standing chose to bond with a human, the rite created a legal and metaphysical relationship that granted the human specific protections under blood law, including the right to speak in court proceedings, the right to accompany their bonded vampire into any space that vampire was permitted to enter, and the right to know within reason the nature of the political obligations their bonded vampire carried. In practice, it had almost never been invoked with a human. Most vampires who used the right did so with other vampires. The handful of historical cases involving human consorts had been, without exception, politically inconvenient for the court, because a human bonded by ancient right was not governed by the same laws of silence and compliance that kept most humans who knew about the court tractable and quiet. A bonded human could ask questions, could attend sessions, could speak. Evander had explained all of this to Anastasia 6 months into their relationship. On a night in March, when they had been sitting in the library of his estate on the outskirts of Vienna, and she had been reading one of the old court histories he had been gradually allowing her access to. He had told her what the right was, what it meant, what it would cost her in terms of the life she had previously imagined for herself, and what it would give her in return. She had thought about it for 48 hours. Then she had said yes. The ceremony was small. It required specific words, specific witnesses, and the recording of a specific document that was then filed with the court's archivists, and in theory, protected by the same blood laws that protected every other instrument of the ancient rite. The vow was written in the old language, Carpathian Gothic, which Anastasia had spent 2 months learning to read before the ceremony, because she had absolutely no intention of swearing to anything she could not understand. Evander had found this profoundly moving in a way he was not entirely able to articulate. Though he had tried, in the careful way he tried at everything, the vow bound him to her protection. It bound her to honesty with him. It recognized their choice of each other in language that was, even in translation, startlingly beautiful, the language of a time when words were understood to have weight, when a sworn oath was a thing of genuine substance and consequence, when the act of choosing someone was understood to be an act of genuine and costly courage. What neither of them had adequately anticipated was how much Velthorn would hate it. Velthorn had been trying, for the better part of a decade, to push through a series of reforms to the Nocturne Compact that would significantly expand the court's authority over certain lucrative human financial institutions, in which several of the older bloodlines had deeply entrenched interests. Evander had been blocking these reforms consistently, on the grounds that any expansion of vampire influence in human financial markets carried an unacceptable risk of exposure, and that exposure would destabilize everything the compact had maintained for 4 centuries. His opposition was principled and well-reasoned, and it was winning because Evander had enough political relationships built across enough centuries that when he opposed something, it tended to stay opposed. Bonding to Anastasia had not changed his politics, but it had changed his position in one important way. It had given Velthorn a target. The accusation was fabricated. Anastasia had not leaked anything to anyone. She had indeed attended the gallery session of the lower council 3 weeks before the night of the dissolution attempt, and she had indeed gone home that evening and had dinner with her friend Mara Hofstadter, who was a journalist at the Vienna Independent. But she had not spoken to Mara about the council session. She had spoken to Mara about whether Mara thought the eggplant at the restaurant they were in was overcooked, and about whether Mara's disastrous situation with the man from her gym had resolved itself, and about whether either of them wanted to see the new exhibition at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. The article in the Vienna Independent had been about an unrelated financial scandal, and the single line in it that could be stretched to reference. The Eastern Territories Compact was something any reasonably informed journalist could have inferred from publicly available documents. But the accusation did not need to be true to be strategically useful. It only needed to be plausible enough to justify a dissolution vote, and in a court where Velthorn had been quietly building his majority for 3 years, plausible was sufficient. Evander had discovered the plan 4 days before the decree was issued. One of his oldest allies, Lady Morova Kestrin, had sent him a coded message through a channel Velthorn did not know existed, warning him that the dissolution was coming and that the vote had already been secured. Evander had spent 4 days moving with the controlled urgency of someone who has learned that the trap is already set and is trying to find the mechanism before it springs. He had not told Anastasia immediately. He had told himself it was because he needed to verify the information before alarming her, which was true. He had also told himself it was because he was still working on a counter-strategy, which was also true. What he had not told himself, because the truth of it was too difficult to sit with, was that for the first time in 431 years he was genuinely afraid, not of the court, not of Velthorn, of what it would mean to watch someone he had chosen, someone he had brought into this world deliberately and with full knowledge of its dangers, pay the price for his enemy's politics. Anastasia had found out anyway. because Anastasia was always paying attention. She had noticed the way he read his messages as differently, the way his stillness in the evenings had a different quality than its usual peace, the way he was watching exits when they were in public spaces. She had sat across from him at breakfast on the morning before the summons arrived and said quietly and without drama, "Tell me what's happening." He had told her everything, including the parts he had been attempting to spare her. She had listened in the attentive way that he had come to love most about her, the way she had of making her whole self available to information, not just her ears, but her understanding, her intelligence, her willingness to sit with difficult things without flinching. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What does dissolution actually mean?" "In concrete terms, the bond is legally severed," he said. "Under blood law, you lose all protections. Your memory of the court would be selectively altered by the court's designated practitioners. You would not remember me." The words landed in the room with the weight of something irreversible. "And you?" she asked. "I would remember everything," he said. "That is, I believe, part of the intention." She looked at him across the breakfast table with the expression she wore when she was furious, but refusing to be ruled by the fury, clear-eyed and focused, and absolutely, characteristically her. Can they actually do that? The memory alteration. Does the blood law genuinely grant that authority? In a dissolution proceeding, yes. It is written into the original compact as a safeguard. The logic being that a human who carries knowledge of the court but is no longer under the protection of a bonded vampire is a liability. "That's not a safeguard," she said. "That's a hostage." "Mechanis," he agreed quietly. She had been silent again. Then she said, "What options do we actually have?" This was what he loved about her. Not that she was brave, though she was, but that bravery with her was never the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear make the decisions. She was afraid. He could see it in the slight tension around her eyes, in the way her hands were very still on the table. She was afraid, and she was asking what options they had, because that was what you did with fear if you were Anastasia Prescott. You used it as information, and then you got to work. They had talked for 6 hours. They had considered every option with the methodical thoroughness of two people who both had, in their different ways, significant experience with the analysis of complex systems. They had considered appealing to the court's own charter, which included provisions for challenging dissolution proceedings on grounds of fabricated evidence. They had considered reaching out to Morova Kestrin and the 2 other council members who had quietly signaled their unease with Velthorn's consolidation of power. They had considered whether Evander's legal standing within the court gave him the authority to formally challenge the decree before it was enacted. And they had eventually, together, arrived at the specific legal mechanism that Anastasia had spent the following 24 hours preparing to use, the ancient rite of bonding included in its original formulation, a provision that Velthorn had clearly either overlooked or underestimated. The provision stated, in language that was 300 years old and carried the full weight of the court's founding instruments, that no decree of dissolution could be enacted in the presence of the bonded human if that human chose to invoke the rite of recitation. The rite of recitation meant exactly what it sounded like. It meant that if the bonded human was present at the dissolution proceeding and chose to read aloud the original vow in the original language in its entirety, the dissolution decree was legally suspended until a full review could be completed by the court's founding instruments, a process that required, by the same founding instruments, a unanimous vote to continue, not a majority, unanimous, which meant that as long as any single member of the founding instrument panel refused to vote for continuation, the dissolution could not proceed. And moreover, Nocturnes sat on the founding instrument panel. This was why the summons mattered. Velthorn had sent it as a courtesy, never imagining that Anastasia would use it as an entry point. He had expected her to either not come, or to arrive too late, or to be too frightened or too ignorant of the specific provision to invoke it. He had not counted on the fact that she had spent 18 months studying court law with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only armor available to her. He had not counted on the particular quality of her intelligence or the particular quality of her courage. He had underestimated her in the specific way that very old, very powerful people sometimes underestimated someone who arrived in a plain work uniform without the trappings of status. It was, Anastasia reflected as she unfolded the paper in the grand chamber while 12 vampires stared at her, the kind of mistake that only got made once. The document in her hands was the original vow, not a copy. The original, which Evander had retrieved from the estate's sealed library the previous evening, and which she had spent the night before memorizing phonetically in addition to reading it. It was written in a hand she recognized as Evander's, careful and precise and slightly archaic, even for Carpathian Gothic, in ink that had maintained its darkness against the pale parchment with the stubborn persistence of something that had been made to last. Article 7 of the Ancient Rites Founding Provisions, she said, her voice perfectly steady, grants any bonded human the right of recitation in the presence of a dissolution proceeding. I am invoking that right now. The silence in the chamber had a texture to it, the kind of silence that forms when a room full of people all perform the same rapid internal calculation and arrive, at slightly different speeds, at the same conclusion. Velthorn's face remained immobile, but something in his eyes shifted, a fractional, quickly suppressed flicker that might have been the expression that centuries of political experience had taught him to never let show. The provision is archaic, he said. It has not been invoked in over 200 years. Archaic, Anastasia said pleasantly, is not the same as invalid. Your own charter specifically states that founding instrument provisions retain their authority regardless of the frequency of their use. Article 3, paragraph 9. She had memorized that too. Evander, who had been standing at the center of the chamber with the controlled stillness of someone who has trusted someone completely and is watching that trust prove itself, allowed something to change in his face. It was small. Most of the people in the room would not have seen it. She saw it. She looked back at the document in her hands, and she began to read. Her pronunciation of Carpathian Gothic was imperfect. She knew this. 2 months of studying a dead language with modern reference materials did not produce fluency, but she read it carefully, sounding each word with the attentiveness she brought to everything that mattered. And the words themselves did what she had understood they would do. The first time she had read them in translation, before the ceremony, before everything. They were not the legal language of a contract. They were something older than that, the language of genuine choice, of 2 people looking at each other across all the distances of species and history and mortality and saying, with full awareness of the cost, I choose this, I choose you, not because it is safe or simple or sanctioned, but because the alternative is to be less than what I am capable of being, and I refuse that diminishment. She read every word. She could hear, in the silence of the chamber, that some of the lesser nobles had moved, not away from her, toward her, slightly, the unconscious gravitational pull of witnessing something true. When she finished the final line, which translated approximately as, and this choosing is not a single moment but a continuous act, renewed in every morning that follows, and every night that is shared, and every silence between us that requires no words, she lowered the document and looked at Velthorn. "The right of recitation has been invoked," she said. "Under founding instrument provisions, the dissolution decree is suspended pending unanimous review. I believe Lady Kestren is on the review panel, Morova Kestren, who had been standing against the far wall with the expressionless composure of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time, inclined her head toward Anastasia with a precision that managed to convey, without a single word, the full weight of her respect. "The suspension stands," Kestren said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "I will not vote for continuation. The provision is invoked. The decree is suspended." Velthorn was on his feet, not loudly, not theatrically, but in the way a very old and very powerful person moved when they understood that something had gone wrong that could not be immediately corrected. "This is a legal technicality," he said. "The evidence of interference remains. The case can be remade." "The case can be remade," Evander agreed, stepping forward for the first time since Anastasia had entered the room. His voice was very quiet, and it filled the chamber the way his voice always did. Not because it was loud, but because it carried a quality of absolute authority that centuries of genuine power had layered into it. "And when it is, we will present the evidence that the original accusation was fabricated. The article in the Vienna Independent, the journalist who wrote it, the timeline that demonstrates my bonded partner was not its source. The communication records that were altered by someone with access to the court's own archival system." He looked directly at Velthorn. "Someone whose access codes have been used at unusual hours for the past 3 months. The chamber went very, very quiet. Lady Seraphina Draven, to her credit, maintained her expression, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, had gone absolutely rigid. "I have been preparing this case," Evander said, "since Lady Kestren sent me her warning 4 days ago. I have been preparing this case for longer than that, in truth, because I have known for some time that the opposition to my position on the compact reforms had moved beyond political argument into something considerably more personal. I gave them the opportunity to prove me wrong. They have not." He paused. "I am prepared to present the full evidence to the founding instrument panel at any time the panel is prepared to convene." What followed was not quick. Court proceedings, even when the outcome was no longer in genuine doubt, had their own gravitational pace, shaped by 4 centuries of protocol and the particular reluctance of the very old to acknowledge the need for adjustment. There were formal objections and formal responses. There were requests for documentation. There were 2 recesses, during which Anastasia stood in an anteroom with Evander and his single trusted aide, a spare, ancient vampire named Aldrich Sabo, who had been with the Carpathian line since before living memory, and who regarded Anastasia with the careful, measuring attention of someone who had been watching Evander for 4 centuries and was making a final, definitive assessment. During the second recess, Evander crossed the small anteroom and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him in the way she always had, directly without performance. His hands came to rest on either side of her face, cool and careful and completely certain, and he said, in a voice that was not for anyone else in any way, "I have been afraid tonight." "I know," she said. "Not for myself," he said. "I know that too," she said. "You were afraid I would be hurt because of your world." "Yes, your world is my world," she said. "We established that when we said the vow." He closed his eyes for a moment. It was such a small gesture, such an entirely human gesture, and it was the thing that had struck her most in the early months. The way his immortality had not erased the human shapes of emotion, but had simply given them 4 centuries to deepen. When he opened his eyes again, he said, "The founding instrument panel will find in our favor. The evidence is clear, but Velthorn will not stop. His strategy has failed tonight, but he still has political resources, and he still has the reforms he wants, and he still has allies who will follow him because their interests align with his. So we need a new approach," she said. "We need," he said, "to decide together what we're willing to do and what we're not, because some of what is available to me involves moving through this court in ways that require patience and time and strategic tolerance of people I find genuinely contemptible, and other options involve a more direct confrontation that would resolve this faster but would cost more." "Tell me about both," she said. This was what she had done from the beginning. Not followed him, not deferred to him, stood beside him at full height, and engaged with the actual substance of what faced them, not as someone who needed to be managed or protect from difficulty, but as a partner in the literal and legal and emotional sense of the word. He had been prepared to love her. He had not been prepared for how that specific quality of hers, the absolute insistence on genuine participation, would feel after 4 centuries of being ultimately alone in every room he had occupied. They talked for the full duration of the recess. They decided together. The found instrument piloting panel convened the following morning in a smaller chamber below the Grandmer, with a formality that was quieter and more genuine than the theatre of the previous night. Anastasia was present as a right, not a courtesy. Moreover, sat at the panel's center, flanked by 2 other members who had been for the past year part of the quiet coalition building itself in opposition to Velthorn's consolidation. The evidence was presented methodically. The fabricated communication records, the actual timeline of the Vienna independent articles' sourcing, the access logs showing alterations made to the court's archive by an account tied to Serafina Draven's administrative credentials. Serapha's cooperation, when it came quickly. She was not a fool and she was not a fanatic. She had aligned herself with Velthorn, because his proposed reforms would have benefited her bloodline's financial interests significantly. When the financial interests became insufficient to outweigh the legal and political consequences of what the evidence showed, her calculation changed. She provided the documentation of Velthorn's full strategy, including 3 years of planned moves against Evander's position, including the manipulation of 2 lower council votes that had been incorrectly recorded, including the specific instruction she had received to frame the interference accusations in a way that would survive initial legal scrutiny. Velthorn, when confronted with the complete scope of what Serafina had provided, did something that no one in the chamber had expected. He did not rage or deny or mount a further defense. He sat very still in his chair at the head of the table he had occupied for 80 years, and he looked at Evander with an expression that was, underneath everything else, exhausted. "You have won," he said. "I have not won anything except what was already rightfully mine," Evander said. The question of the compact reforms remains, and I intend to engage with it, because some of what you want is not unreasonable in its core intention, even if your methods were." He paused. "The court functions because we have laws, not because we have the ability to break them when they are inconvenient." Velthorn looked at Anastasia. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since she had entered the grand chamber the previous night, and the expression on his face was not the contempt she had expected. It was something more complicated, something that was reluctantly, painfully close to recognition. "You read the vow," he said. "You had memorized it." "I had memorized it," she agreed. "And I meant every word of it. That was the other reason I chose to read it aloud." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "We underestimated you?" "Yes," she said. "You did." The formal process of dismantling the dissolution decree, reversing the fabricated evidence findings, and entering the formal record of Velthorn's violation of court procedures took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Anastasia continued going to work at Bistro Lichtenberg. Because she had shifts scheduled and colleagues she liked, and because she had no intention of letting the seismic events of her other life disconnect her from the ordinary rhythms that kept her grounded. She also spent a significant amount of time working with Evander and Kestrin on the drafting of a formal proposal for the compact reforms, a version that addressed the legitimate financial interests of several bloodlines without creating the exposure risk that Evander had consistently opposed. It was detailed, careful work, the kind of work she was actually good at, the analysis of complex systems, the identification of provisions that created unintended consequences, the drafting of language that meant precisely what it said, and nothing else. Evander sat across from her at the library table for hours at a time while she worked, reading or managing his own correspondence, occasionally asking her a question or answering one, and she would look up sometimes to find him watching her with the quality of attention he had given her since the second Tuesday, the particular focused warmth of someone who is still slightly astonished by what they have found. "You're staring," she said one evening. "Yes," he agreed, without apology. "It's distracting." "I know. I will continue regardless." She had thrown a pen at him. He had caught it without looking up from her face, which was so thoroughly, perfectly him that she had laughed, genuinely and freely, and his answering expression was the one she loved best of all the ones she had catalogued over 18 months, the one where the 400 years of careful control briefly became insufficient to contain the fact that he was, underneath all of it, simply and completely happy. The night the formal decree reversal was ratified by the founding instrument panel, they were alone in the library of the estate when the notification arrived. Aldrich Chabot brought it personally, a single, sealed document, and laid it on the table without comment, and withdrew with the discretion of someone who had spent 4 centuries learning when to be absent. Evander picked it up, broke the seal, read it, and set it down. He looked at Anastasia. She had been watching him since Aldrich entered, reading the quality of his stillness, the thing she had learned to do almost without thinking. She saw the seal break, saw the reading, saw the moment when the document landed on the table and his hands went quiet and open on its surface, and she knew before he said anything. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. The relief was not quiet. It moved through the room like something physical, like a change in air pressure, and she got up from her chair and crossed to him, and he stood to meet her, and she wrapped her arms around him with a fierceness that said everything she had not said during 3 weeks of careful, methodical, focused work. He held her with the particular care he brought to every physical expression of feeling, the awareness of his own strength in relation to her relative fragility, always present, always compensated for, but tonight there was something additional in it, something that pressed against the careful control like light against glass. "I need to tell you something," he said against her hair. "Tell me," she said, a pause, the kind of pause that she had learned over 18 months to wait out, because Evander's pauses before important things were not hesitation, they were the gathering of precision. "When I understood what Velthorn intended," he said, "my first instinct was to find a way to protect you from it by removing you from the situation entirely, to send you somewhere he could not reach, to manage the proceeding without your involvement, to handle it as I have handled every political difficulty for 4 centuries, which is to say alone and without giving anyone else the weight of it." "I know," she said. "I chose not to do that," he said, "because I understood, in the hours I spent deciding that the choosing of you as my partner was not meaningful if I then refused to let you be my partner when the cost of it became real. That choosing you for the safety and the warmth and the beauty of it, but not for the difficulty, was a lesser thing than what we had sworn to." He stopped. "It was the hardest decision I have made in 4 centuries. She pulled back just far enough to look at him. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded quality that he was still learning to allow, the expression that had arrived gradually over 18 months, the one that said that the 400-year architecture of self-sufficiency was, in the presence of this specific person, no longer required. "The vow says continuous," she said softly. "It says renewed in every morning that follows." "Yes, you renewed it," she said, "that night in the grand chamber before I arrived. When you decided to trust me, renewal." His hands moved to her face again, as they had in the anteroom, and he said, quietly and completely, and without any of the careful management that he normally brought to the expression of what he felt, "I love you, Anastasia." It was not the first time he had said it. It was the 4th, actually, and she had kept count because she understood what it cost him, and because each instance was genuinely distinct in its character, the way precious things are distinct from each other, even when they share a category. The first had been quiet and slightly unsteady, the voice of someone who had not said those words in 4 centuries, and was surprised to find them available. The second had been during the night. She had been ill with a fever that was mundane by any measure, but that had caused him an entirely disproportionate 3 hours of controlled, white-knuckled concern. The third had been in the garden of the estate at 2 in the morning, when she had made him look at the stars and told him the names of the constellations she knew, and made up increasingly elaborate false mythology for the ones she did not know. And he had laughed, and then stopped, and then said it with the quality of someone making an inventory. This one was different from all of them. This was the voice of someone who had stood at the edge of losing something and understood, with a completeness that only proximity to loss can provide, exactly what the thing was. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She reached up and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the library around them was warm and quiet, and full of old books that had survived 4 centuries, and outside the estate's windows, Vienna about its night, with no awareness at all that in a building on its outskirts, something true was being renewed. The formal restructuring of the Nocturne Court took considerably longer than the dissolution reversal. These things always did. Political change in an institution where the principles were immortal had a particular texture, because the principles knew better than anyone that time was not a finite resource and could be deployed strategically, that apparent concession could be a long game, that patience was a weapon as much as anything else. Velthorn had been formally censured by the founding instrument panel and stripped of the Arch-Chancellor position, which was handed in an interim capacity to Kestrin. His political influence had been significantly reduced, but not eliminated, which was intentional. Evander had argued explicitly against elimination, on the grounds that completely marginalizing someone with Velthorn's remaining alliances created an adversary with nothing to lose, whereas a man who retained some of what he had valued and understood exactly how close he had come to losing all of it was a man with incentives toward caution. It was, Anastasia noted, a remarkably sophisticated piece of political analysis, and Velthorn himself, in the single private meeting that occurred between the two of them some weeks after the formal proceedings concluded, appeared to understand it perfectly. That meeting had been Evander's idea. He had told Anastasia about it before it happened and described his reasoning and asked whether she trusted his judgment on the approach. She had considered it and said that she trusted his judgment and also wanted to be kept fully informed of what came out of it, which he agreed to without hesitation. Velthorn, in that private meeting, had said nothing particularly illuminating about his motives. He did not apologize. He had too much pride for that, and Evander had too much intelligence for an apology to have meant anything useful. What he said, instead, was that Evander's proposed modifications to the compact reforms had resolved 3 of his 4 central objections, and that, if the 4th could be addressed in revision, he was prepared to withdraw his opposition formally and publicly. Evander had come home and reported this to Anastasia, who was making coffee she actually drank, and she had looked at him over the kitchen counter and said, "That's his move back into relevance. He backs the modified reforms publicly and reframes himself as a constructive voice." "Yes," Evander said. "It's smart," she said. "It is," he agreed. "He is not a fool. He is a man who made a fundamental error in the way he pursued his interests, and he is looking for the version of recovery that costs him least. Can his 4th objection be addressed?" she asked. "It can," Evander said, "if you're willing to look at the language in section 12 again." She had put down her coffee. "Show me." They had spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with the draft documents, and by the end of it, the 4th objection had been addressed in a way that also, on reflection, strengthened the overall provision considerably. Anastasia had a particular gift for finding the precise word that removed an ambiguity, the product of 3 years of academic training in the close reading of historical documents, applied now to documents that were not historical at all, but very much present and consequential and written by people who were still alive. The modified proposal went to the founding instrument panel. It passed with Velthorn's formal and public support on a clear majority. The Eastern Territories Compact was renewed on terms that balanced the financial interests of the old bloodlines with the exposure protections that Evander had always maintained were non-negotiable, and the Nocturne Court entered a period of relative stability that the older members, speaking carefully and without tempting fate, described as the most constructive political climate in 40 years. None of this resolved every difficulty. The political landscape of the Nocturne Court was 400 years old, and it would continue to generate difficulties for as long as the court existed, which was to say indefinitely. Evander remained a central and often contested figure within it, which meant that Anastasia's life would always contain dimensions of complexity and occasional danger that a different life would not have. She had known this when she said yes to the vow. She had known it in every subsequent choice. The knowing did not make it comfortable, but comfort had never been what she was after. What she was after was what she had found, a life large enough to hold all of her, the history degree, and the waitressing shifts, and the ability to read Carpathian Gothic, and the late nights in the library, and the mornings that Evander spent in the peculiar vampire suspension that served him as sleep, still and silent and pale and utterly himself, and she would sit in the armchair beside him with coffee and a book, and the particular quality of peace that she had not known she was capable of until she found what she was capable of it with. Mara Hofstadter, Anastasia's journalist friend, had noticed over the months that something significant had changed in Anastasia's life. She could not know the specifics, and Anastasia managed this with the same careful honesty she brought to everything, never lying, never pretending, simply declining to enter the territory that would require lies. Mara knew there was a man, which was not a secret. She knew he was unusual, which was an understatement. She knew that whatever had happened in the autumn had been serious and had been resolved, and that Anastasia had come through it more firmly rooted than before. She had, in the way of genuinely good friends, allowed Anastasia to hold what needed to be held privately, while making clear that whenever the appropriate time came, she was available for the full story and several bottles of wine. The night the compact reform vote passed, Anastasia had gone to Bistro Lichtenberg for her shift, because she had a shift, and because the rhythms of ordinary life were not things she intended to abandon. And Evander had arrived at 11:47, as he always did, and sat at his usual table. She had brought him a coffee he would not drink. He had said please and thank you. She had watched him read for an hour between tables, near the end of her shift, when the dining room had emptied and her colleague Marco was settling the last bill. She came to Evander's table and sat across from him. He looked up from his book, which was the same worn, cloth-covered thing, without a visible title, that he had been reading the first night she ever served him, because he reread it periodically for reasons he had once tried to explain, and she had listened to carefully and not entirely followed. "Long night," he said. "Good night," she said. "Better now." He closed the book. Outside, the Viennese rain had started again, the same intermittent autumn rain that had been falling the first time he walked through that door, and the candlelight moved in its particular way across the planes of his face. The extraordinary white hair, the thundercloud eyes, the expression that had been, through 17 Tuesdays and 18 months, and one ancient court and one very old vow, gradually, perfectly, becoming readable to her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the vow. The original," she said, "and what you said, about it being a continuous act, a yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did not always do in public, but which he did now with a simplicity that said the consideration of observation had become irrelevant. "I would like," he said carefully, "to say it again." She understood what he meant, not the legal instrument, not the court proceeding, not the founding provision that had protected them both. The words themselves, the meaning of them renewed. "Here?" she said with a slight smile. He glanced at Marco, who was diplomatically absorbed in wiping down the bar. "Here," he confirmed. She squeezed his hand. "Then say it." He said it quietly, in the old language, and then again in her language. And the words were the same words they had always been, the language of choice made deliberately and at cost, and held to not because it was easy, but because the alternative was genuinely unthinkable. She said them back, in the careful Carpathian Gothic she had spent 2 months learning and had not stopped practicing since. Not perfectly pronounced even now, but said with the full weight of what she meant. Marco, wiping the bar at the far end of the room, found something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. There were, as the months continued to turn, things that required further navigation. The question of Anastasia's mortality was one that they did not avoid, because it would have been a form of dishonesty to avoid it. And they were both, in their different ways, profoundly committed to the practice of not avoiding difficult things. The blood law had provisions regarding this, as it had provisions regarding almost everything that had ever arisen in 4 centuries of vampire life. And those provisions were not simple and had costs attached to them that required genuine consideration and ongoing conversation rather than a single deciding moment. They talked about it the way they talked about everything important, at length, with the lights on, looking at each other directly and saying what they actually meant. Anastasia's position was that she was 26 years old and there was a significant quantity of life to be lived before the question became urgent, and that rushing a decision of that magnitude because of anxiety about the future was precisely the kind of fear-driven thinking she had always refused. Evander's position was that whatever she chose, including the full ordinary span of a human life, without the complication of the available alternative, was a choice he would honor without reservation, and that his preference was irrelevant except as information for her to hold, and that his preference was, if she wanted it, that she stay. She had considered this for 3 days. She had asked 17 specific questions because she was who she was. He had answered them all honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was complicated or uncertain or difficult. She had said at the end of the 3 days, "I'm not ready to decide that yet. I want to keep living this life and see who I become in it, and then I'll know better what I want." "Yes," he had said, "that is exactly right. It was exactly right." And it was the kind of decision that did not close anything, but instead held everything open in the particular way that was appropriate to a thing being genuinely, carefully lived rather than managed from a distance. She stayed at Bistro Lichtenberg until the end of the year, when an opportunity arrived that she had not anticipated and could not refuse, a research position with the University of Vienna's Medieval History Department, focused on the governance structures of pre-Enlightenment European institutions. The irony of this was not lost on her. She was now, in the daily course of her work, studying historical governance structures while spending her evenings with someone who had personally participated in several of them. Evander, when she told him about the position, had sat very still for a moment and then said, in a tone that she recognized as his equivalent of delight, "The department head is Dr. Liebmann." "You know him?" she said. "His grandmother was a scholar of some reputation," Evander said. "I assisted her research once, in 1953. She had stared at him. "You need to tell me about that." He had told her about it. It had taken most of an evening and had been, like most of what he told her about his own history, simultaneously fascinating and quietly astonishing in the way that an unbroken thread of 4 centuries of personal experience was always astonishing to encounter. The sheer accumulation of it, the weight of all those witnessed years. She listened to all of it, as she always had, the way that made it mean something to him to tell it. And afterward she said, "I want to know all of it, everything you remember." "That is," he said, with a smile that arrived slowly and meant the most, quite a significant quantity of material. "I know," she said. "I have time." The spring came to Vienna with its particular quality of arrival, the way warmth returned to the stone of old buildings, and the lindens on Ringstrasse began to flower, and the whole city softened at its edges. Anastasia walked to the university in the mornings and came home in the evenings to a house where someone was always there, present, and ancient and completely, specifically known to her. She worked on her research, and he worked on his court business, and they met in the middle of the evenings in the kitchen or the library, and the ordinary shape of a shared life built itself around them with the unhurried steadiness of something that does not need to announce itself. There was one afternoon in April when she came home from the university to find Evander standing at the library window, holding a letter and looking out at the garden with an expression she had not seen before. She put down her bag and crossed to him and looked at his face until he noticed she was there. "What is it?" she said. He held out the letter. It was from Velthorn, formal in its address, brief in its content. An acknowledgement that the governance of the past months had been conducted well, that the compact reform had proven in its initial implementation to be working as intended. A single sentence that was not an apology, but was, from a man of Velthorn's constitution, the closest thing to one that the language was capable of producing. And at the very end, one line that stood apart from the rest. "I did not understand what the vow meant to you. I understand it now." Anastasia read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and gave it back. "He's not wrong," she said. "No," Evander agreed. "A lot of people don't," she said. "That's why it had to be read aloud." He looked at her for a long moment with the full, unhidden warmth that she had watched arrive and consolidate over 18 months. The expression that was the accumulated product of every choice they had made together, every morning renewed, every difficulty faced, without the deflection of pretending it was not there. "The court believes," he said quietly, "that the vow is a legal instrument." "I know," she said. "It is not only a legal instrument. No," she said, "it never was. Outside the library windows, the Viennese spring continued in its unhurried way, and the garden held the particular tender green of April, and the city above the estate went about its business in the afternoon light that reached the garden's edges, but not the house, where the drawn curtains maintained the necessary shadow. She had learned to love the quality of afternoons in that house, the slant of light from unexpected angles, the way certain rooms held warmth even without direct sun, the particular domestic architecture of a life built around someone who was not built the way the world expected people to be built. She's learned, in the aggregate of all the months, that loving someone specific was a different kind of knowledge than loving the idea of someone. It was less luminous and more actual. It included the knowledge of small habits and specific preferences, the way he organized his correspondence with a systematic thoroughness that was mildly maddening, the way he listened to music she would not have expected him to like. It included the knowledge of his silences, which were varied and readable once you had studied them long enough. It included the knowledge of his particular grief, the kind that accumulated at 4 centuries of staying, while others did not, the grief that did not have a single object, but was a kind of weather in him, present and managed and occasionally surfacing. She had asked him about that grief one night in February, with the directness she brought to things that mattered. He had been silent for long enough that she had thought he might not answer. Then he had said, carefully and precisely, that there was a quality of loneliness in perpetual duration that was not the same as the ordinary loneliness of being without specific company, but was more the loneliness of continuity itself, of being the thread that persisted while everything around it changed, of being always the one who remained. She had understood this intellectually and felt it across the distance of her 35 remaining decades of likely human span as a kind of vertigo. The intimacy of imagining it was itself a form of love, she had realized. The willingness to try to understand what cannot be fully understood. You have not been entirely alone, she had said. You have had Aldrich. Aldrich is loyal, Evander had said. Loyalty and companionship are not the same thing. No, she had agreed. They are not. And then, because it was true, and because she intended to keep saying true things to him, for as long as she was capable of saying things, she said, "You are not alone now." He had looked at her with the expression that she would choose, if she could choose a single frame from the entire 18 months to keep forever, because it was the expression that held all of it, the age and the care and the careful, costly opening of a thing that had been guarded for a very long time. "No," he had said, "I am not. The Nocturne Court." In the autumn of the year following the dissolution attempt, adopted a revision to the founding instrument provisions that clarified and expanded the rights of bonded humans within court proceedings. The revision was proposed jointly by Kestren and Evander and passed with a majority that included, in a development that no one had predicted aloud, though several had suspected, Felthorne's affirmative vote. The provision was named in the old language, which translated approximately as the provision of the present witness, and its language drew explicitly on the recitation rite that Anastasia had invoked in the Grand Chamber on the night of the dissolution attempt. She had not been asked whether she wanted to be cited in the provision. When Evander told her about it afterward, she had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "They put a waitress in the founding instruments." "They put my bonded partner in the founding instruments," Evander said, who is also a scholar with more working knowledge of court law than many of its long-standing members, who happened to be working as a waitress when we met. "I still work there on Saturdays," she said. "I know," he said. "I come in on Saturdays. You never drink the coffee on Saturdays either." "The coffee," he said, with the dry, perfect patience that was among his most endearing qualities, "is irrelevant to the reason I come." She had kissed him for that, and he had let her, and outside the Viennese autumn was doing what it always did in September, turning the air sharp and clean and smelling of rain, and inside the library the lamps burned warm against the coming dark, and the old books stood in their patient rows, and somewhere in the city above them, ordinary life continued in its ordinary way, unaware that below its streets there were chambers where ancient things were decided, and old vows were renewed, and a woman in a serving apron had stood up and read the words that changed everything. It was not a perfect life. It was something much better than that. It was a specific life, with specific dimensions and specific costs and specific beauties, lived between two specific people who had looked at each other across every distance and found the distance crossable. It was a life that began every morning as the previous one had ended, with the conscious Chon fully aware act of turning toward each other. It was the continuous thing the vow had always described. On a Tuesday in September, just over 2 years after the first rainy night, Anastasia, set a cup of coffee on Evander's table at Bistro Lichtenberg. At 11:47 in the evening he said, "Thank you." He opened his book. She went back to her tables and he remained at his, and Marco kept his eyes on the bar, and the candles moved in the way they always moved, and the rain fell on Vienna exactly as it always did in autumn, and the night was, in the most important way, exactly the same as it had always been. The coffee went cold untouched. It had always been beside the point.